my name's Jason Gillam. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Secure Ideas. I'm for a C-level position, just like all of the C-level positions at our company. I am extremely nerdy and actually do pen tests and stuff as well. So I come from a background of development, enterprise architecture, and application security. And I'm a Burp extension author for those of you who've used Burp Suite before. Something I haven't written much in the way of Burp extensions recently. I keep meaning to. I pulled
but the ones that you wrote are so useful, it doesn't make a difference. It's okay.
Well, I know they need a little bit of, they could use some refinishing at this point. I think CO2 is now several years old. But anyway, I love gaming and homebrewing. So that's my hobby. Also recently started flying drone around, which is pretty cool. Drones have really come a long way. So, and I'm a father of two and husband. And to you, Eric.
And I'm Eric Kuehn. I'm one of the principal consultants here at Secure Ideas. As I said before, I don't know if anyone who's listening has heard me talk before. This is not my normal voice. I was lucky enough to catch a head cold on my anniversary weekend, and as well as Father's Day. So, you know, good times there. I'm going to be color commentary. Hopefully it will stay clear color. Just as a joke.
Not green or yellow.
Yeah, instead of the development program, I'm definitely an infrastructure Windows AD guy. Spent a lot of time doing designing and managing and maintaining Active Directory environments, as well as everything that supports it, Windows architecture, etc. I have not created anything for Burp, but I have contributed to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And if that's something you're not aware of, I really recommend you look it up. It's a great method to have teams be able to talk to each other and understand exactly what's going on. Our jobs and everything that we do tend to have a lot of acronyms, or people call different things or the same thing, different terms, whatever it may be. And if everybody says, hey, this is the attack that we used and it's number 1 on the framework, at least, you know, everybody can see the exact same thing. You don't have to worry about some strange terminology here and there. But it's a great method for also planning attacks, working within your organization to make sure you're defending against different attacks, etc. So when I'm not working, I like to play games and watch movies. Board games, computer games. I don't get to play computer games that much anymore, but lots of stuff with games and movies. And then I am a father of 4. All my kids are getting older now. I used to say my hobby was taking my kids to their hobbies, but now our hobbies are all kind of aligning. So we get to watch the same movies. Like we watched Nobody last night together as a family. That was kind of fun. So that's me in a nutshell.
All right. Okay, so before we start with the 9, so
we both have to laugh at that when we say 9.
9, yeah. I have to laugh. So Amazon Web Services, for those of you who are not super familiar with them, they include a lot more security controls than just 9. So what we wanted to talk about today is some of our favorite recommendations that that we think everybody should be aware of and be using. And most of these, not all of them, but most of them are included with AWS or with parts of services that are there. So there's little to no incremental cost to using them. In some cases, there's like a little bit of a storage cost to it. But it's I think for most of what we're going to be looking at today, it's minimal.
Yep. And to top it off, on top of that, every single service you get with AWS has their recommended best practices and security guidelines and things like that. And so it can get very difficult if we're going to pick apart every service. So really the ones that we're talking about have a breadth, right? They're going to affect more than just I use EC2 instances, right? It doesn't make a difference what you're doing in AWS. Almost all of these will be something that any organization can use and instantly start seeing some benefits.
Yeah, good point. Oh, there's actually one more thing. I forgot to put a point on here. For the most part, we're going to skip over security controls specifically around EC2, because we figure anybody who's going into AWS, standing up an EC2 instance and what you can do to that ends up being a lot like your traditional types of controls. So we want to focus more on here's the extra stuff that you get with Amazon Web Services. So we've done quite a bit, actually, quite a bit of most of our infrastructure is there, and we even do some development there as well. So I guess we'll get started, or I will get started, and if Eric really feels like jumping in, then we'll let him. So first on the list is having an identity and access management strategy. One really cool thing about AWS is it provides some basic framework and tooling around that, but you can do it a few different ways. Actually, you can do it probably more than a few different ways if you put your mind to it. It provides the building blocks, and then you kind of pull it together into a solution that works for you. So it's very easy, and this is a bit of a pitfall actually, to start working in your AWS account and then not really have any strategy at all. And then next thing you know, you have a bunch of users, groups, roles, a whole bunch of things defined, and there's no organization around any of it because you've just turned stuff on as you needed it. So you want to kind of get away from that, that line of thinking, and work towards some sort of strategy that'll work. So there you have options that include just using what's already there, just the built-in stuff. You can also do federated or OpenID. So if you wanted to, for example, let's say you're a Google Suite organization, then you could use your Google. You could set it up so that your Google accounts are what you use to log in to get into your AWS, or Azure is another option. So,
or Okta. Okta has been very popular from different groups that we've looked at.
Good point. Yeah. You're going to have policy statements. So sort of like specialized firewall rules, I guess, but it's access controls for everything inside of AWS. Sorry, I'm turning off I just realized my alerts were still coming up. You have the ability to, allow or deny access to things. If there's no policy in place to access something, then the default is just you don't have access to it. So you have to have at least some policy that allows an action to take place before it can.
Including the ability to modify your own account, which is a great thing. Yeah, so, hey, we created everybody an account in AWS, their own ID in the account, but nobody can actually do anything with it because they don't have the ability to modify their own ID. So
yeah, that's a good point. It can actually, if you don't set it up with some basics on there, then they can't even go in to do something like change their initial password or turn on their MFA. So you have to be able to set up some of those things, and they're going to need permission to do that. So, there's a lot on this slide, so I'm trying to figure out what I should skip over.
The big ones are, right, you could say you can take actions, you cannot take actions, or you're not allowed to do these actions. All of them, when you're building your policies, right, it's always a fine-tuned balance. And we're going to have another talk about IAM later, which we don't want to, we're trying to highlight this, but really you have to be careful when you're building your policy statements and how they're formed. Just like every other application or system out there, you really want to do least privilege when you're digging into it. And it is very easy and common to not do that when you start moving into AWS, when you start doing these policies, because there's so much to do. And a policy can only be so long, and there's all these other limitations around it. And so suddenly you just start going that you can do all these things, do anything you want, and suddenly you've opened your account up to all sorts of potential issues. Some good situations like that are the not actions. You cannot do these things. Well, that means you can do everything else if you choose not to do a non-action. Mm-hmm. So just it's important to know how those policy statements work, and you build them with that idea of least privilege, not only to the actions you want to assign, but then also to the resources they're going to. Trying to lump everything together into one policy is not the best way to do it.
Yeah, you want to have several different ones. In addition to the policies define those rules, so you have these sets of policy statements, and there's an example of one there on the in the little square there on the right-hand side of the slide of what that might look like. And this is a very simple one, but you also have a way to match those up or match up a policy or a set of policies with a user on a temporary basis. And that's something called a role. I say user, it's actually any principal. So roles are used extensively when a service needs to talk to another service as well. It can assume a role to do that. But then you can also have, through it's a service called STS. I can't remember exactly what it stands for now, but we'll see some examples of it later as well. But it allows a user can come in who has permission to assume that role to then assume that role, and then through that role they gain additional permissions to do things. And sometimes that's jumping to another account. So you log into one account and then you assume a role on a different account that gives you whatever permissions you need on that account. A good example of that one would be you might have like a centralized account where that's where all of your actual user accounts are. So I'm using account twice here. A central Amazon account where all of your user identity accounts are. Exactly. Yeah, that's where all the identities are. And then maybe you have a separate like QA account or dev account or whatever, where you don't have users in there, but you have a role set up so that any user who is allowed to assume a developer role can then become, whatever they need to have in that account. Maybe it's even admin. So we've set that up before for accounts that, don't have any sensitive data or anything in there that we're worried about. So it ends up being a one-way street too. You can't then go from that dev account and somehow magically reverse roll yourself back to the main one, right? That's not how it works. So I'll move on to the next one here because I want to give us time to cover a lot more stuff. On August 5th, we're doing another webinar. It's going to jump into a lot more of the capabilities inside of identity and access management in more detail. But there are a few other things that we'll just touch on right here. So there are tools that can help you figure out what those policies and rules might look like. And one of them is, and also find issues in them as well. So access, these are all in the identity and access management panel as well. By the way, if you log into the console, you'll see access analyzer on there. And it basically generates findings against your policies. So that one I think is going to be covered in detail on August 5th on that webinar. But basically the idea is that it looks for cases where a certain policy would maybe allow you to do something or allow someone outside of your zone of trust to perform actions. And then highlight those. So it gives you, an action list of things to review at least, and then maybe even make some changes based on it. The credential report's basically a CSV that you can review manually. It just lists all of your users and the basics of their access configuration. So whether or not they've set a password the last time they logged in, whether or not they've have any API keys or SSH keys set up, et cetera, et cetera. So it's basically just a one line per person on there. Pretty easy to look through and sort and find potential issues to follow up with people on. You have your organization activity. So it's basically it tells you when's the last time each of the Amazon services that are available was accessed by anybody in your organization. So that can help you determine whether or not you have services that you're never using or services that you haven't used in months. So, that's useful little tool there as well. And all three of those, there's no incremental costs at all to using those. You can just use them. And then the last bit on there in terms of knowing what you can do or what you're using is SCPs, or service control policies. And we actually have those expanded on another slide here. So if you're working inside of Amazon Web Services and you have multiple accounts, so you've set up an organization, then you really want to take a close look at service control policies, because they are organizational-wide settings for policies, basically. So it allows you to standardize those access policies so that when you create, I don't know, like, let's say you have a policy for administering roles. So a role administrator policy. And you want that to be identical across all of your accounts, then you could set up a service control policy that would restrict the access to just what is necessary to administer roles. And then that becomes something that's available in all of your accounts. So it doesn't actually set the permissions per se. It's mostly about limiting the maximum allowed permissions for certain things. So.
Yep. It makes sure that everybody's working, no matter what. As we mentioned before, when people set up policies, it can often be, you can do all this wonderful stuff to everything, just because we said everything. Service control policies are a great way of limiting what people can't do, because you as an organization have decided we're not ready to start diving into AI within Amazon Web Services, or we are never going to build anything in Frankfurt, Germany. So let's not even allow that to happen, right? We're not even going to have that be there. That way, we as an organization don't need to worry about somebody who has the ability to do this accidentally doing it or intentionally doing it and us losing sight of it, right? AWS is so big, just like any of the big global providers, excuse me for a second, it's easy to have things be created. And unless you have a very diligent view of what's going on, easy to lose track of what's happening, and things suddenly appear all over the place.
You end up with somebody experimented with something 6 months ago. And
exactly. Why do we still have this workspace for, like 2 years ago that nobody's using? In Germany. And so it's a great way of having that like maximum possible thing that can occur, regardless of what an individual policy really says. These can override those policies.
You kind of think about how this might work when combined with the organization activity that I mentioned on the previous slide, right? So find out what are the things that you're never using, and maybe you create a service policy around that to prevent them from being used at all. So
to jump back one quick thing there with knowing who can do what, not a lot of it. Some of the things that we talk about are based upon the idea that you are using AWS as your identity provider for AWS. When you start moving into federated identities and things like that, you don't have a user identity anymore in AWS. You have roles, and you're just assuming roles based upon information from that other provider. In that case, things like the credential report and a couple other items won't give you any information because there's actually no credentials there except for the root credential. And you do want to make sure that that's not being used, but you wouldn't see things for other people. So I just wanted to highlight that really fast.
That's a good point. All right, so moving on. So I know one turned into the Spanish Inquisition, so we ended up with multiple slides on that. The rest of them aren't like that, I promise. So number 2, require multi-factor authentication.
I can't believe we have to say this, but we have.
It's one thing to use it. It's another thing to require it, right? So make sure that all of your users are using it. Now, this is something, again, if you're using federated identities, you're going to do that through your whatever you're using to provide your identity provider, I guess is the right term for that, right? Yes. That's where you will do that. But if your users are inside of Amazon Web Services, then you're going to want to set this up. MFA prevents most attacks against the user accounts directly, right? It's a very effective control, so make sure that you're doing that. And it's relatively easy to set up, especially for roles. Remember, earlier on I said you have the STS service on there. You can see in the little box there it says action STS : assume role. So that's that service and the ability to assume a particular role. And right below that we have a condition, which is multi-factor auth present. So what you can do is you can make it so that in order to be able to assume a role, and what you do is you put this on any a rule for any role that can be assumed by a person, and require that they have multi-factor authentication in order to be able to access it.
Yep, and it will prompt them even when using the API key, right?
Yeah.
If they assume the role within the console, then they don't get prompted again for their MFA because they would have had to use it to log in, hopefully, if you set it up properly. But if somebody is using an API key or other programmatic method, they'll get prompted again.
Yeah, does it on the command line. It's pretty consistent. So.
Unfortunately, that also means that if you're using federated identities, you can't use this control because once again, that's all assumed by the federated portion, right? So you can't add that as a control within AWS unless you're using AWS for the identity. So one more thing about number 2, require MFA. Even though we're talking about AWS, that really is for any cloud system, right? Your control, your security, everything is based upon a user's identity, and that's just a password unless you have MFA of some kind, right? Physical token, whatever. MFA needs to be everywhere when you're talking about cloud-based applications.
Using a Google Authenticator or AuthCode is so easy to set up these days. You should be using it for everything. Okay, so number 3, stop managing your SSH keys. So when we first started in AWS, the first thing we did was we moved our existing infrastructure into EC2 instances, and then we set them up basically the same way, or close to the same way. And when you create a EC2 instance in AWS, you'll notice that you get prompted for hey, do you have the key for this, or which key do you want to use? And so the assumption is you're going to use SSH to administer that instance, which is fine. But there is for most cases, there's a better way. So Amazon now has something called the Systems Manager. And inside of Systems Manager, there's a Session Manager, which basically for most types of EC2 instances that you can run inside of AWS, it will provide you the ability to administer it directly inside of your browser, right inside the AWS console. So you've already logged into AWS, and as long as you have a role with a policy in place that allows you to administer that instance and use System Manager, then you would be able to log in as a user that can sudo as well. So if it's a Linux instance, so you'd be able to get administrative rights by doing that as well. So everything you need to administer things. It works on Windows and Linux. You get one really cool feature about this is that each of those sessions, like everything that you type in the console, once you're inside of one of those systems, it all gets logged into a CloudWatch log. So you can go back and see, what exactly somebody typed in, or what commands did you use to, patch that system or whatever. You always have the ability to go and see that history. It has some requirements. Now, if you use like several of the default images for EC2, then System Manager is already set up, and all you need to do then is make sure that the role supports it. There's also, for those that don't have an agent set up already, there are agents that you can download and install as well on those. In fact, I think you can even use System Manager now for your on-prem stuff if it's VPN.
You can, yeah, if you wanted to. You have that set up. You could go through and, and configure everything.
It's not something we've done, but it, you know, that's kind of
on-prem servers.
Yeah. Sorry. So some limitations. There are certain things you can't do, at least not initially. There's ways around it. So like doing a TCP dump, some port forwarding and stuff like that. So
to highlight this, I will never forget. We were, man, I don't remember, but Jason, myself, and another one of our consultants, Alex, we were headed home from somewhere. I don't remember if it was an offsite or if we were heading back from an engagement, but something needed to be done to an instance in AWS. We're like, man, what are we doing? I'm driving. We didn't have a Chromebook available or a Windows box that we could use. But Alex pulls out his phone. It's like that big. Logs into AWS to his phone, jumps on, does everything on that tiny screen somehow still, and managed to do everything he needed to on that EC2 instance to fix the problem for another guy. So as we're driving along, Alex is fixing things on his phone. So it works on pretty much anything.
Yeah.
As long as you have a good web browser.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. That's a really good point. I totally forgot about that. I remember it now, though. So, all right.
And then on top of just doing Systems Manager with Session Manager, right? Systems Manager itself has all these other wonderful tools, which we could talk about in lots of detail, but we don't have time. Like, automatically do patching, some level of change management, a good inventory management of systems in AWS, as long as, once again, all of your instances are configured to use Systems Manager, which is a different setup in itself. It doesn't come by default, but there you go. Yeah.
That's a good point. Inventory management actually has an incident manager built in too now, which I haven't checked that out yet, but it's on my list.
Hopefully we don't need to use it, but hey.
No, my understanding is, my understanding is it's more for building out incident response plans and administering those. So it sounds like a cool little thing.
Cool.
All right, so number 4, treat it like a data center. So what we're talking about here is some of the stuff that you do around networking permissions. So not everything that you throw into the cloud needs to have internet access, especially as you start adding more and more infrastructure.
I know this is a shocking statement to some people.
I know,
maybe not people here right now, but some people might be shocked by this, considering some of the environments that we test and look at.
Exactly. So one thing that's not on here is you don't necessarily have to give an EC2 instance a public IP address, right? It can have so that makes it much harder to get to from the internet if it doesn't have a public IP address. Yeah, just a little bit. In addition to that, there is a whole set of capabilities around network ACLs that you can use. Basically, it's just like your traditional stateless firewall rules. So as you set up various different subnets inside of your account, you can control the access between them in and out pretty easily. Just with, rules that the formatting of the rules also should be familiar to anyone who's done network administration before.
But they are stateless. You have to do every path in and out. Very important.
That's true. So if you're looking for something that's more dynamic, you'll want to consider alternative options. The other really big thing is security groups. So by default, whenever I'll talk about it in terms of an EC2 instance, just because that's the most concrete example. However, security groups are applied to all kinds of different services. Any sort of compute, Lambdas, everything. Yeah. So, but basically, it's kind of like endpoint firewall rules. So you bind them to a host. So you can set up a set of rules. Like a very simple example would be, I want to set up a rule that allows inbound port 80 and 443. And then you would call that my web server security group. And then what you would do is add that web server security group to each of your web servers. And that would allow access to that port, but would not allow access unless you had an additional security group on there. There would be no access allowed from other ports. So
once again, saying everything is not good. Many times with the idea, I don't know, some organizations have the problem where they move to the cloud and the idea is it's supposed to be more open. I'm not sure, but we run into situations where people are inadvertently allowing more access to the internet than they should, right? Or even within your own network in your environment, right?
To or from, yeah. That's actually one thing. Security groups work in both directions, right?
Right.
Inbound and outbound. Yeah.
Yep. But even within everybody on-prem, or lots of people on-prem have issues with using, client-side firewalls, whether on servers or devices, but servers we're talking about mainly here. And also the whole idea of segmentation, very difficult, right, to do on-prem. It requires firewalls and redoing your network and literally how everything is functioning. When you move to AWS or other providers, right, it's much easier. It's very easy to say, I don't care where you're coming from, you only can access these specific ports, right? So the idea of treating it like a data center is not just from the internet, but also internally. We don't need everything to talk to everything. Let's break it down a little bit more, make it a little bit harder for a bad guy to do some damage if he manages to compromise a host.
Exactly. One thing to add, a big gotcha with security groups is
just one.
Like a lot of things in cloud services, they're so easy to spin up and create more of that you forget they're there. So
the dead security groups. Yeah, sorry, good point.
Security groups are one of the worst because you create one to attach it to just about everything else that you create. So if there's a security group involved. And so you end up with this abundance of these orphaned groups just kind of sitting there.
Or something that we don't have as a great control that maybe we should have put in there, tag everything.
Tag everything.
We need 10, number 10. So tag everything. There's nothing worse than going in and doing a review of all those orphan security groups. And there's nobody on this call who might have done this inadvertently, reviewing all these security groups, and you find one that doesn't seem to go or do anything. And it just has this name. And you're like, well, it doesn't have any rules. It doesn't do anything. And suddenly nobody has access to your production database because it was actually allowing the instances to talk to the database.
Yes.
I didn't say that. I didn't do that, I promise. Yeah, so label and tag everything, really, very important, knowing what these things are.
Yeah, but here's the thing, to your defense, and I'll expand on this just a little bit for those who are somewhat familiar with AWS but may not know this little fact about security groups. When you're setting up your rules inside of the security group, you will, part of that is you will tell it what IP addresses this rule applies to. Right, so it could be star, for example. I want anybody to be able to connect into my port 80 and 443. So anyway, if it's a security group that's on a database, then you might run into this problem of, okay, well, each time I spin up my EC2 instances, they're getting a different IP address. So how do I address that? And so what you can do is you can basically use a security group instead of an IP address.
Yeah.
Right.
Nested security groups.
It's kind of like a nested security group. It's a little bit weird to think about it that way because like this thing is actually performing two purposes now instead of just one. So you could create an empty security group. You wouldn't put any rules in it, and you would call it like DB client, database client. And then you would use that instead of an IP address in your rules, and then any EC2 instance or anything actually that you add that security group to is automatically treated as if it can fulfill that rule and would be granted access. So
tag everything is what.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird. Yeah, so make sure you tag all the things. So anyway, moving on. Manage your secrets. So this one is mostly for developers, a little bit less for infrastructure can make use of it too, but it's particularly useful for developers. So there's something inside of AWS called a secrets manager. Very handy. Guess what it does? It's for managing secrets. So it provides a relatively easy way to store and control access to those secrets because just like everything else we talked about, if you need a role-based policy in order to be able to have access to a secret inside of Secret Manager. So it makes it easy to control what services are allowed to access those secrets. And secrets can be anything. It's the normal format on it's a string basically, but you typically would format it as a JSON structure and think of it in terms of key value pairs, basically for accessing the information inside the secret. So one common strategy for this for software development or a strategy that we've found works really well is you'd create a separate secret for each of your environments that you're deploying to. So you'd have one for production, one for QA, one for dev, one for whatever else you have. And then you can grant access to just that secret for that environment. And then you would basically pass that in as an environment variable itself. Which secret should I be using, kind of thing, depending on what you're doing. Either, EC2 is relatively easy to sort it, but let's say you're building Lambdas or you have a bunch of containers going. You would be able to set it up so if the containers were running inside of prod, then they would have access to the prod secrets and they'd be able to pull those. So cool stuff there. It's a solution to storing credentials in source control, right? That's one of the main risks that this mitigates. So number 6. So know what's going on. There's a lot of logging that occurs inside of cloud systems, and AWS does tons of it. So one thing, it's a best practice, and this is the one thing that does get very expensive that we're talking about today, is network flow logs. So it gets more expensive depending on how much data you have going through your network, right? So it can get expensive quickly. However, if you're familiar with, what's the traditional network term for this? Is it flow log as well, or something else?
My brain is not for me to tell you. Sorry,
yeah,
I'm not prompted for this one.
That's fine. But basically, yeah, it's the same thing as traditional controls for basically keeping track of all of your packet. It's not necessarily every packet of data. It's like the metadata around that. So how much information went from what point A to which point B, that sort of thing. In addition, CloudWatch is the Swiss Army knife of logging and monitoring inside of AWS, right? It has tons of capabilities. I put a little screenshot on the right side. Might be a little bit hard to see. At least it is on my screen. But that gives you a menu of some of the stuff that's there. So you have all of your logs basically end up there. And then even though the logs themselves are also stored in S3, they're viewable through CloudWatch. You have metrics in here. You have the concept of events, and you can even create event buses. So certain types of things you might want to like generate or throw events onto an event bus that then is used for various different types of notifications to other systems, for example, or for populating a dashboard or something. You have support for serverless. That's what the service lens is used for, and then also container as well, Lambda insights. You have the concept of synthetics there near the bottom of that, which is the synthetics or canaries are, think of it as little scripts for checking something. The simplest of these would be, is my website up, right?
It's not just a support up. Can I like connect and get a valid response back from it? So I'm looking for this info. Yep. Yeah, it's those types of things that, as administrators, we always have different ways of doing that. One great thing about integrating it here is it's very easy to create the script and then start it up. And there's even some templates available. And then you can have that data basically feed into one of the metrics on here. And so that once your metric actually goes, above a certain level, then it triggers an alarm, right? So there's a bunch of different things you can do like that. It's a very powerful tool. In addition,
So CloudWatch is for, that's for mostly for logs. Well, it's for all the logs. This is what's our name. So CloudTrail is specifically logging around what is happening inside of your AWS instance. Like, what are your users doing and your services? So you know how we talked about policies several times here. So whenever somebody attempts any action against a policy, or that gets evaluated by a policy, that would be then logged inside of CloudTrail. So all of the things are logged in there. There's a screenshot, the large screenshot at the bottom here. All I wanted to show on this one is that there is a event history inside of CloudTrail. Allows you to very quickly sort of filter down to what exactly are you looking for, what sort of information to see what happened in your account, who did what, who broke the something or accessed something they shouldn't have or whatever.
You changed a policy.
Yeah, exactly. There's also another really cool thing that you can do is you can integrate cloud alarms inside of CloudWatch, because all of your CloudTrail logs go into CloudWatch, and so you can set alarms on different things that happen inside of there. The CIS, if you're familiar with CIS benchmarks, they have a CIS AWS Foundations document, and inside that one, it actually gives you the setup for configuring a set of CloudWatch alarms for various different things that could happen in your account, like such as someone attempting to access a service that they don't have permission to, or attempting to log in without MFA or something like that. So all of that stuff's really cool. That's a very useful tool, and that doesn't cost you anything to set up, really. So that CloudTrail, CloudWatch, and CIS.
Yeah, the network flow logs are the one that will cost you.
Yeah, they will, but some people need them. So. Yep. Configuration management. So we've played around with this a little bit. You can see on the compliance status on here, we haven't spent as much time as we should.
We set it up just what it was, and we said this is how we want everything to look, and then we ignored it. No.
Yeah. So here, the problem here is really it's. I think it takes more tuning than what we've spent time on. We actually have looked through, and we've done quite a bit in our account to clean things up, especially in our production account. But what's happened is some of the rules that we've set up trigger very frequently. And one of those is, and we talked before about having security groups that are orphaned. They're not connected to anything. That actually triggers one of these compliance rules, right? So, and each security group is its own resource. So if we have 100 security groups that are orphaned, then that's 100 non-compliant resources right there. So the number adds up very quickly. As you're going through them, you can you can group them and check them off and do things with them, which is an exercise we probably need to go through more often.
Yeah, the important part about the configuration management is, well, AWS is fairly dynamic. And I'm not talking about this EC2 instance changed this IP address because we spun one up and we spun one down and we did all this stuff. This is really your overall configuration, right? Certain defining characteristics. You just need to be sure that your configuration, your gold standard, matches what your environment does. So if suddenly your environment now has this whole new website that's built upon, I don't remember what you built it upon, Jason, all these other things, and it self-deploys, but you never put that in your config manager, that's all broken, right? As far as config manager is done. So really you need to keep your gold standard up to date with what you're actually doing. And then it works great.
Now, some of you might have noticed this list on the right as well, operational best practices for, and then fill in the blank. So this is actually a really interesting thing about AWS config is that it comes with a whole bunch actually. That's only part of the list that's shown there. Sets of compliance rules that you can apply. You can customize them or create your own as well, but there's a lot of built-in rules for common conventions. Like you have your CMM levels on there, you have CIS, there's some for NIST, there's some for PCI. There's actually a set of rules for NERC SIP in there somewhere as well. So There's a bunch, so very useful. And then you can have these also trigger notifications through SNS. So it's good stuff there. Move on to number 8. We're running out of time. Write custom scripts. So for all of the things that maybe you can't find a tool that does exactly what you want it to do inside of AWS already, no worry. Amazon Web Services is meant to be a bunch of services that you glue together in various different ways. And one of the pieces of glue for doing that is using custom scripts or Lambdas inside of AWS. So a Lambda is basically, it can be JavaScript or Python. There's also support for Java. I think there's support for Go. There's some other ones too. So there's several different runtimes that can be used. And think of it as like a mini container that spins up, runs your script, and then spins down afterwards. So that's basically what you're doing with Lambdas. And so you can have it do just about anything. Lambdas themselves, as long as there's a role applied to the Lambda that provides permission to access other services, the Lambda can access all of the other services available on AWS. So it has a lot of synergy with CloudWatch because from within the Lambdas, whenever you log something, that automatically goes to a CloudWatch log. That's where basically the system logs are stored for each Lambda. CloudWatch has built-in cron-like capabilities. So if you want to set up basically a cron tab to run various different Lambdas for different purposes, that's pretty easy to do inside of CloudWatch. For your Windows people, that's a scheduled task. Or scheduled, yes. Sorry. Moving on. Scheduled task. You can generate a stream of metrics for doing various different things. That can turn into a dashboard, right? With a visual display on it and all that kind of stuff inside of CloudWatch. And of course, you can get alerts and notifications as well. Some examples, these are some things that we've done with it. You can we iterate through all of our IAM users every day to find out who has aged or unused API keys. And then we notify those users and disable the keys. So it's the second two parts that make the Lambda very nice, right? It's other ways of iterating through that information that we talked about, but actually telling them, hey, do this, and then just disabling it if they don't do anything is kind of a nice bonus. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We also report on issues with EC2 instances like Eric had mentioned tag everything before. So we actually look for certain tags. We have one that's an owner tag. So we can't create an EC2 instance without assigning an owner. Otherwise, that gets reported through this Lambda, right? There's some other things we do there too. And then another thing that you can do with Lambdas is you can integrate some of your alerts with third-party services because, hey, you're running Python or JavaScript, so having that talk to some other API endpoint outside, like Slack, for example, to give you Slack alerts or alerts in Slack is completely within the realm of being possible. Yeah, move on here. I see there's a question, but I'll wait till the end. So protect your static data. So I know everyone knows about, the typical S3 bucket, don't make it public, all that kind of stuff, right? So kind of moving beyond that, some of the really cool stuff that you can do is it inherently allows you to have it like default encryption on that data. Which you should be doing. Yeah, which you should be doing, especially unless that it's meant to be public data, right? If you have a public website, then maybe you don't care. Right. But for anything that you intend to be encrypted, or that's even remotely sensitive in nature, you might as well turn it on. It's server-side encryption. There's little to no overhead to store it that way. It doesn't cost you anything extra. So. But the other really cool thing is, as you see on the screenshot here, there's a bunch of different tabs that allow you to do a whole lot of other things, including keeping version history and such. But one of the really nice things on there is the lifecycle rules. So if you have a certain type of data that falls under a retention/destruction policy, so you want to keep that data around, but you only want to keep it around for a certain period of time, you can set up with a lifecycle rule. You can make it so that that data gets expired and deleted on schedule automatically. So you put the data in there, it sits there in the S3 bucket right up until this example rule here is 7 days. So we use that for temporary files that we're making available for download, and throw it in there, and within 7 days it's gone. So we don't have to worry about, like, let's say it's something like a container or a not a vagrant, but a virtual machine image. So potentially a very large file. It's not eating up space there for a long time. We don't end up paying for it. So very cool feature on there, but also very useful for security purposes. So, all right, moving on. Here's a recap. So number one, make sure you have an IAM strategy. Take a bit of time and figure out how are you going to manage your users in your account or your accounts, and how are you going to manage their privileges and roles across multiple accounts if you're in that situation as well.
And honestly, sorry, just to jump in, one big good strategy is have more than one account in many cases, right?
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of having your user identities live in one account, or if you're using a federated there, right? And then you have roles that kind of dictate where other people can go to, right? Instead of having everything jumbled in one AWS account. It's very nice to have them split apart.
Yeah. So. And sometimes, I mean, if you think about it, there's some huge advantages to creating additional accounts beyond just how you provision things. You think about it this way: if you have a need to do a bunch of work on a temporary basis, then creating an account temporarily for that work then allows you to shut down that account afterwards and delete all resources associated with that work all at once. And then you don't have things dangling out there, right? So that's kind of a cool thing about that too. Number two, require MFA. You can actually set that up to be required. There is no button to do that though. So you're going to actually have to get your hands dirty with setting up your policies accordingly. Yep. Stop managing SSH keys. So you're going to use Systems Manager for that instead. Number four, treat it like a data center. So as you build out subnets, which you should be doing if you have enough structure in your account to require that, build out your subnets and set up appropriate ACLs between them.
Don't let everything talk to everything. So you should say, treat it like a data center you want. I don't. Moving on.
Some sort of segmentation, yeah, is a good thing. Manage your secrets. So especially talking to the developers out there, use Secrets Manager. Don't store your database passwords in your source control. I mean, you should know that, but Secrets Manager is the right solution for that. Know what's going on. So there's all kinds of logging capabilities, and heck, one thing that you can do is you can even have. I didn't talk about this before, but when I was talking about the synergies between CloudWatch and Lambdas, you can even have certain types of logs trigger a Lambda with that log message to do certain things, right? So all of that's the capabilities around that are phenomenal and limitless. Really, it's up to your imagination. But know what's going on. You have the logs. Everything's being logged. You do have to. I think you have to turn on CloudTrail. I don't think it's on by default.
Correct. You have to turn it on.
Turn it on everywhere.
Nothing is turned on by default within AWS. Yeah. You have to choose to turn everything on.
So CloudTrail, you should just turn it on. I don't remember how much it costs. I think it's, if I remember correctly, really the only cost is the storage cost for the logs.
I believe so. Do configuration management, number 7.
Yes, I was trying to remember where I was at. Configuration management. There is a config tool in there, right? So especially if you're in an industry that requires compliance, but even if you're not, then then you should take a look at that, and that'll help you get through some of the problem areas, like having all of those security groups that don't really belong to anything. Write custom scripts where you need to. So, make use of what's in there. You have the ability to actually run stuff within the context of your AWS account, so why not? And the other thing too, I didn't mention this service in here, but there's something called the CloudFormation stack, and what you can do is you can create a template that includes the code for one or more Lambdas in there and their connections to other services. And then that becomes a thing that you can deploy into multiple accounts, right? So you write it once, then you just deploy it, and then all of your accounts get the updated version of what those scripts do, which is useful. And then protect your static data, right? So don't forget about your S3 buckets and the ability to use lifecycle rules to delete stuff that doesn't need to be there any longer. So we're almost at the end. Want to thank everyone who joined or who's watching this after the fact. So if you would like to look at our other webcasts, we do keep posting them under tiny.si/webcasts as a shortcut to it. I think, so upcoming we have one that's specific on AWS Identity and Access Management. It delves into more detail there. We also have, there's a reoccurring lunch and learn session. I think we actually have one this week. Yeah. And then also, if you're interested, we do a quarterly newsletter. And you go to tiny.si/news to sign up for that. And all we do in the newsletter really is we go over some of our highlights from the past quarter, and then also some of our upcoming events and webinars and such. So it's really a way to kind of stay in touch, and blog posts too. Kind of a way to stay in touch of what are the types of things that we're talking about. All of that's free, of course.